Okay, so this is where we left off yesterday, looking at this. Oh, would you mind turning off the second switch so we can see the board better? There you go. Can you guys still take notes? Okay. So these are all on a list. I just want to be sure that you understand, or at least hear it. If you're like me, you're a little more visual. I remember it much more if someone tells me than if I look at it in a picture. So we're going to go through it, even though you're very capable of reading it. So we started with, we already learned cephalic is head. Anytime you see C-E-P-H in front of something, they're talking about the head. That will eventually be one of our word parts. So we've got cephalic being the head. We've got frontal being the forehead. And we have otic, O-T-I-C, otic being the ear. Orbital is always referring to the eye. Oral to the mouth. Nasal is the nose. Buccal is the cheeks. I was trying to think. I know that there's a way that you can type. I know they've got a name when people grow out what basically look like chops. They used to have a different name for that came from the word buccal. I'm going to have to think of that. It's a fun word. It's funny, I think. Can't think of it right now. Anyway, buccal is the cheeks. Then you've got cervical being the neck and mental being the chin. We'll use the word mental later when we're learning the bones, the skull, the jaw. You might have to know one of the nerves that refers to the chin area and has mental in its name. So anytime you see mental, we're referring to the chin. Acromial, we had talked about, I'm repeating these from yesterday, but acromial is the point on top of your shoulder. So this region, this point on top of your shoulder. In the picture, for right now, you just have to identify this top of the shoulder area. Once we get into the skeletal system, you're going to have to identify the acromion process. We'll talk about it. It'll come up again, I guess, when we get to the skeletal system. Then I think we did sternal, which is the breastbone. The sternum is the anatomical name for our breastbone. So sternal is referring to this right here. And the pectoral is your chest muscles, or the chest area. You can see it outlined here. Here's our pectoral area. Remember, here we're talking more about the areas, not necessarily a specific muscle, although a lot of these share the same names as muscles in that area, which is convenient. Axillary, we were pretty familiar with that from our word parts, so that's your armpit. Mammary is referring to the nipple. And brachial is the upper arm. Brachial is the upper arm because if you look down here at antebrachial, that's the lower arm. Antebrachial, A-N-T-E, is the lower arm. Then in between there, we have the antecubital, this little space right in here, kind of the inside of your arm. So if you were going to give blood, you give blood in your antecubital area. Because anatomically that's in the front. What's going to be opposite, do you think, of the antecubital area? What do you think we're going to call the elbow, which is on the other side? The cubital. So over here you see the cubital for the elbow. And there's our elbow. So you have the antecubital on the front, cubital in the back, and your elbow. Abdominal is just referring to, in this case, it's just generally referring to the abdomen. We're actually going to break that down into quadrants. So After I saw this, I realized really there's no point in having abdomen on this area chart because we're gonna break down the abdomen and the pelvic region even more. They have quadrants. So you can take that one off for the quiz. It won't be on the quiz. And carpal is your wrist. Palmar is your palm. That one should be easy. And then digits being your fingers. Then we also have umbilical is your navel, your belly button. Inguinal is the groin region. So when we're talking about the groin, we're kind of talking on either side of the genital area. It's going to be more of a connective tissue and muscular tissue area. Then you've got your genital area. The coxal, and the arrow, I don't know why they have coxal. Well, the coxal in this case is going to be the hip region. Then you've got the occipital region. The occipital region, if you reach behind your head, follow your spine up to your last vertebrae, and you can feel that indent right here. There's like a dip right here at the top of your spine where your skull and your spine meet. That's your occipital area. That region is your occipital area. Then you've got your acromial point again. And your vertebral area. Just kind of the whole area we can consider vertebral. We're not specifically talking about the vertebrae or the spinal cord. We're talking about just that whole region. Then lumbar is the lower back region. And then the sacral region is right where the sacrum is, or your tailbone. It says between the hips, I would say tailbone. Gluteal, I think a lot of you might already know that one, referring to the buttocks region. And then the perineal. Not always fun to discuss, but realistically, some of the jobs that some of you might be going into or already have, you will have to discuss the perineal region if you're dealing with patients, whether they're young, whether they're having babies, whether they're geriatrics. Unfortunately, there are issues that come up. So it is a word that I want you to be familiar with. So if you ever hear someone talking about the perineal region, you know what they're talking about. So it's talking about the region right around the anus. And then I added one, the manus, M-A-N-U-S. The manus region, if you ever hear that, is just referring to the entire hand. So the whole hand. Femoral is the thigh. Again, that kind of refers back to the skeletal system. What bone is it referring to? The femur. So it should be pretty easy to remember there. It's the femur is where it comes from. Oops, that's an R. And then this one's always, I always have my favorite words. This one isn't my all-time favorite, but this one's one of them. The popliteal area is the area behind your knee. I don't know why I like that word. For some reason, it's fun for me. But popliteal is this area behind your knee, behind the, back of the knee. The front on the anterior side, the posterior side is the popliteal. The anterior side is the patellar region. So we don't say in the knee region, we say the patellar region. Once again, named after what bone? The patella, which is basically your kneecap. I mean, it is your kneecap. That little bone on top of your knee that kind of slides around, that's your patella. So that's your patellar region. Then you've got, in here you've got your tarsals. So your wrists are carpals. and your ankles are tarsals. So I can't read that, so I think it says ankles, but so you've got carpals right here, wrist, tarsals, ankles. Pedal, P-E-D-A-L, is your foot, which is convenient to remember since you pedal a bike with your foot. I don't think it's a coincidence that they call them pedals, but your whole foot. So just like we refer to the whole hand as the manus, you refer to the entire foot as the pedal. And then we can break it down into its parts. We have digits, or palmar. And in this case, instead of palmar, we have plantar. How many of you can already think of one diagnosis related to the plantar region? Plantar fasciitis, which is when the muscle or the connective tissue in the bottom of your foot gets really, 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 really tight. It doesn't get stretched out enough, and it's very, 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 very painful. And it takes a long time for therapy to start working on plantar fasciitis. And a lot of times if you don't keep up with it, it starts to get worse all over again. It's kind of something you deal with for the rest of your life. Anyway, so just like, it'd be kind of like the anatomical equivalent on the feet of the palms on your hands. So it's the bottoms of your feet, or the soles of your feet. You could think of it as the soles of your feet. Not S-O-U-L-S. All right. Do you guys have any questions about any of these areas? Hopefully a lot of these make sense and they're already kind of logical for you, so it's not like you're memorizing. I think I counted, there's a total of 42 that you're going to have to know. So we can take one out, we can take abdomen off the plate and you only have to know 41. But a lot of these you already should know or have an idea, or they're logical enough that you'll be able to find it. And I won't use the same picture, but it will be as simple as you'll have a list of words. I'm not going to make you just pull them out of thin air. You'll have a list of words, and you have to match it to the body area. So that will be what's on the quiz on Tuesday. What I might take from this into the chapter test is not identifying by matching. That's why I feel like that in and of itself is kind of some work. Concentrate on that for a little while, put it aside, and then concentrate on the rest. I will use some of these body areas when we're discussing, like if I say, is the palmar region distal or proximal to the acromial region. So hopefully, and I'll try to use ones that I feel are logical and ones that everybody seems to be catching on to. The point in using those on the test for the chapter test is not to trip you up. Some of them, I just want you to see how they're used. Plus, it also gives me more tools in my toolbox for making the questions. Otherwise, it's just going to be the same questions over and over. Where is, your elbow compared to your shoulder? Well, we're going to start moving a little bit away from maybe elbow and shoulder and start using more of our anatomical terms as we learn them. So I'll try not to be challenging with which words I pick. I'll be more interested in you being able to describe their location relative to each other. Does that make sense? You guys with me? All right. Awesome. Okay, so then we also have to know planes and sections of the body for a couple of reasons. One reason is you have to know how to dissect. So if I say make a transverse cut distally from X to Y, you'll know what I'm talking about. Also, we might see slides that say this is, a transverse section of the abdomen, which we'll see a picture of. Then you know what they're talking about, right? Otherwise, if you saw before today or before you had read the chapter, if someone had said, I would like you to show me a transverse section when we do dissections, maybe I might say, show me a transverse section of your pickle. So you're going to have to know how to do that. Or I might say, draw a transverse section of your pickle. Or when we get into the skeletal system, we have one lab where we work with bones that aren't on the cat. I might say, show me a transverse section of XY bone. So there are three main planes. We have frontal, sagittal, also called median, frontal, and transverse. Sagittal is cut right down the midline, separating left and right. So sagittal divides lengthwise into left and right. So that's if you're facing anatomically, you just go straight down the middle, down your nose, middle of your lips, down your chin, down your sternum, all the way straight through, separating equally into left and right. Frontal, frontal divides front and back. So it's going to run this way. If I turn sideways, I'm going to cut my front off of my back side, or cut my back side off of my front side, so that I peel into a front and a back. And then transverse is cutting across the middle, so you have a superior and inferior section when you're done. Does that make sense? So I have some definitions. So sagittal actually has more than one term. There's mid-sagittal, where you cut directly down the middle, so the two parts are equal. Now, sometimes when we talk about these planes or cutting, making these incisions, sometimes we're talking about the entire body or the entire organism. Sometimes we're just talking about an organ. You can have a mid-sagittal plane in your heart. Parasagittal is not down the middle. So it would be off to the side. So you can see here, they're showing a parasagittal cut here. It's still dividing left and right. So it's still sagittal. It just isn't down the middle. And then we had the frontal is also called the coronal. And then transverse is also called the horizontal, which makes sense. Divides the body into inferior and superior. It goes horizontal. Think about the horizon. The horizon runs side to side, not up and down, right? So horizontal, horizon, goes side to side. That would be your transverse. So now, if I were to take a look at this heart, how might this be used? So let's say we have an organ in front of us. And I say, I would like you to make a mid-sagittal cut or create a mid-sagittal plane down down this organ. So mid-sagittal would be right down the middle. That's not very, I just noticed that it was kind of sitting cockeyed when I got to the end, because actually if I were to divide it down the middle, I would go like that. I'm sorry, I'm being very technical. If I said let's make a parasagittal cut, and then once we get to know the heart, I might say make a parasagittal cut to expose the left atrium. So remember, we have to look at the heart, not my left, the heart's left. So if I make a parasagittal cut down the left side, That'd be something like that, right? I'm still dividing it into left and right. It's just not down the midline anymore. Or like I said, here would be a transverse section of the abdomen. Now, if I just put that up there, that would look like a whole bunch of guck. And what in the world are you showing me? Is that a cell? I can't figure out what that is, Mrs. Rice. But since I tell you that it's a transverse cut, that's like taking the body. Remember we had, I'm not very good at drawing bodies, but here's our person, and we went and we made a cut right here, and then we laid him back down and exposed his abdomen. So we're kind of looking at it that way. Does that make sense? So when it's a transverse cut, sometimes that's the hardest one. That's why I kept using that as an example. But those are sometimes the hardest ones if it's a transverse cut to recognize. So this is actually what your body would look like in the abdomen if I were to kind of slice it transversely, kind of right through the middle. So it would be a transverse section. Any questions? Okay, the last part for this week is the body cavities. And so during embryonic development, the body is first divided into two internal cavities. The posterior, which means behind, and the anterior, which is the front. Each of these cavities, then we divide into other cavities. So we're going to break this down. And some of them, we're going to identify the organs that will be in those cavities. Which again, here's our, oops, there's our medical terminology word part, right? Meaning internal. And I think I have that later down here too, so maybe I'll save that. I'll write it then. So we're going to start with the posterior or dorsal cavity. And the reason that they call it the dorsal cavity is because it's part of the spinal cord. It comes behind. You know, if you feel, your spine runs down behind. So think of that as dorsal behind. Yeah. Yeah. That's in your book. That is directly, this paragraph I took directly out of your book. It's a quote, word for word paragraph out of the book. So if you don't want to write it, I'm just saying that in case you don't want to write it all. Maybe paraphrase and then go back and read it or fill it in. So remember how I said we're going to divide the posterior cavities into its different compartments, and then we're going to divide the anterior cavities into its individual compartments. So the posterior has two main cavities. The cranial cavity, which contains the brain, right here, cranial cavity. And then we also have the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord. So the vertebral canal runs along your back. And in the posterior cavity, all these cavities, we're going to learn, they have a special lining and they have a special fluid. This is for protection, right? So the posterior cavity, cranial and the spinal, are lined with three membranous layers called the meninges. We aren't going to learn all three of them. You just need to know that the lining of these cavities is the meninges. Can any of you think of a diagnosis that is the base word for? Yeah, meningitis. Yep. And meningitis is when the lining of this cavity swells. And when that swells, that can put pressure on all of those nerves running in your spinal cord. So that can be a very harmful thing. So meningitis, anything that ends in itis is swelling. Don't have to memorize it now, but that will be one of our base words eventually. So meningitis. When your meningus swells. So that's the lining of the dorsal cavity. Now the anterior or ventral cavity, we also break into a couple of different sub-regions. So we've got abdominal pelvic cavity, which is just the whole section here. So we break that one down actually into these two, so it gets even further broken down. And the reason that we do that is because sometimes you want to talk about the whole abdominal pelvic region, and then other times you want to talk separately about the abdominal cavity or the pelvic cavity separately. So sometimes we refer to them as one, maybe they're all kind of under the same diagnosis, or we're including all of them in our research, whatever it is. Otherwise, we might break it down. So the abdominal cavity is going to contain our stomach, our intestines. I want to make sure I get this exactly right. Our intestines, liver, spleen, and basically it's going to be any of the organs that aren't your heart or lungs or your diaphragm. So anything below the diaphragm. And then in the pelvic cavity, there we've got the bladder, the sexual organs. I gotta think. I don't think, kidneys are in the abdominal cavity. So basically the bladder and the sexual organs. Prostate also if you're a man. Now, in the abdominal pelvic region, we have a different lining. It's kind of a different system. So the membrane that lines these cavities, the abdominal pelvic, is called serous membranes. And the reason that it's called a serous membrane is because it's made out of serum, which is a fluid, kind of like a blood-like fluid, a fluid that has no clotting proteins. So when you think of a clotting protein, you guys have had a cut and it's starting to heal, and you can kind of start to see it starting to scab over. What happens if it's not dried yet and you kind of touch it? What does it feel like? Squishy or sticky, right? So these proteins that cause the clotting are very sticky. So if we take the proteins out that cause the clotting, what kind of serum do you think we're left with? Something really slick. So we take that out so it's really slick. All right, we're going to pick up there on Monday. Bring those worksheets in with you, and then we'll go over them in class as soon as we finish going through the cavities on Monday. Bring index cards also, you guys, so we can give you your brand new 10 medical terminology words.